The Abrahamic Covenant in Genesis chapter 15 is arguably one of the most important passages in all of Scripture, but it's a very difficult one to teach to students, and so we kind of leave it out. So I think this kiddie pool is gonna help us. Let me show you how. All we need is a kiddie pool, 2 buckets of sand, and we've got some stuffed animals. 2 figurines, and some red paint that's gonna double as blood. You take the sand, you put it in the kiddie pool, you take your hand and you create a trough down the center, and that's the setup for this lesson. So one of the reasons this is obviously difficult to teach is that we're just not in this culture anymore where this covenant behavior is normal. At least here in North America, students aren't gonna quite understand what's going on in Genesis chapter 15. This type of covenant was common in Abraham's day. It's a suzerain vassal covenant. If you want to be a Bible nerd or a history nerd, basically it is the greater entering into a covenant with the weaker. God or a king entering into a covenant with a servant. That would be Abraham in this setting. So you can understand why Abraham might be a little bit scared. And normally what would happen is the parties who are entering into this covenant would walk between the blood of these animals. And as they pass through, they would then kind of like shake hands, so to speak, and say, this covenant is done. And if either of us break this covenant, let what has happened to these animals happen to me. That's what would normally happen. But that's not what happened with Abraham and God. And that's why this becomes a significant illustration. With God and Abraham prepares the animals. He knows what he's doing. He sits and he waits. And then eventually God comes in the form of a smoking cauldron. Now I don't have that. I just have Farmer John here. But God comes through and he passes through the blood of these animals. And then he immediately says that this is the covenant that he's making with Abraham. God has passed through the blood, said that if the covenant is broken, let what has happened to these animals happen to me. And Abraham is still over here, having never passed through the blood. So the significance here is that God is taking on both portions of this covenant. He is responsible for fulfilling the covenant and keeping his promise. He is also responsible for the penalty if this covenant is broken, and we know that it is broken. But God has it under control. He's going to pay the penalty for us in the person of Jesus. He's going to send his son. That is why the Abrahamic covenant is so important and foundational. It shows us the ministry of Jesus, why the ministry, the life, and the death of Jesus is so significant to us. It also shows us how we relate to God and how God relates to us. There's 2 things that we need to take away from this illustration, and that is that God's love is unconditional. There's nothing that we can do to cause God to love us any less. He's not going to take away his love for us. He's not going to take away his promise for us. There's also nothing that we can do that earns God's love. His love is unconditional. It's also everlasting. So unconditional is the first thing. Everlasting is the second thing. Unconditional and everlasting. Everlasting meaning that God is not going to change it. It's always going to be this way. There is no reason for God to change the way he relates to his people because he is able to fulfill this covenant on his own. I think that for me is a significant encouragement. So it helps me understand the gospel, it helps me understand the ministry of Jesus, and it helps me understand my relationship with God in a really powerful way. So I don't want to hesitate teaching students this. They have to grasp this early on in their faith. It's fundamental, and if a kiddie pool, 2 buckets of sand, some stuffed animals, and some figurines with some paint can help us, then we've got to try. So I hope that this can be an encouragement for you. I hope that you can take this, run with it, change how it, make Scripture come alive for these students, because it's so important that we grasp these things. So thank you for being a part of this community, and thank you for staying and watching this silly illustration that we have. I hope that it's encouragement for you. I hope that you can use it moving forward, and I look forward to being with you in the next one.